All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the virtual breakfast. My name is Eric Anderson. I'm the soybean educator for the state. I'll be your host this morning. It is my honor to be able to present to you Dr. Manni Singh, who is our
Oh,
cropping systems agronomist. Most of you probably know him as Manny. He's going to talk today about corn and soybean planting considerations, talk through some of his research findings. So, Manny, thanks for joining us. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. You can take it away.
all right. Good morning, everyone. I know we all are waiting to get our planters going here. So today my goal is to talk through some of the key decisions that we need to be making now, right, to set up a high yield potential for the rest of our cropping season here, right? And I'll touch on again a couple of points. The first one I always start with of all the factors we test every year. Planting time is the one that always wins out, in terms of its critical importance, right? For us here in Michigan, again, on the northern edge of crop production, right? Compared to if you see any data from I states, the story will probably look a little different. And this picture shows you what I'm talking about, right? Our goal in crop production is to develop and close this canopy early in the growing season to maximize sunlight interception, convert into biomass, and then those grains that we are chasing, right? And you can see here some of these timely plantings towards the left of these pictures are closing canopy quite earlier than those later plantings, right? And this picture sort of translates into these data that we collect every year. A lot of data goes into developing this figure I'm showing you here over the last 7, 8 years or so. We start planting again, starting with soybeans here around mid to late April, right? And I'm showing you relative yield here. So 100% means that we are at that maximum yield potential, which is anywhere from 50, 60 bushels to getting close to 100 bushels. Couple of key points here, right? Number one is this shows you the importance of timely planting, right? This dotted vertical line shows you our optimal planting time was towards end of April. But you can also see the rate of decline as the planting gets delayed, right? Shows you that we have this longer window of planting, right? As long as we were able to plant by mid-May or so, we were still able to maintain close to the max yield potential, right? And then the yield starts declining at a much faster daily rate of decline. So those average daily bushel numbers you see are not exactly accurate, right? So that's for beans. Now let's look at how the story is for corn. Looks very different, right? One of the key point here is that as we push corn into these early season non-ideal planting conditions, talking about cool and wet soils, corn does not like that, right? Compared to a plant like soybeans, which seem to be more forgiving, right? Our optimal is probably around early May or so for corn, because timely planting is still critical. As we are getting late, this slope is getting actually much steeper than even soybeans. So timely planting in corn is critical, but again, there is a window here where when the conditions are not exactly ideal for corn, we can probably try to get some soybeans in ground, right? And this is where, again, there's a lot of PR on early soybean plantings, right? And as I'm showing you, there are rewards, right? At the minimum, we are getting extended planting window. That's allowing us to minimize any yield penalty that comes from late planting towards those end of May or even early June plantings, right? And we have had some data showing yield increase with early planting, including small plot as well as on-farm research as well, right? But the risks are still there, right? Establishment of good plant stand is really critical, and we will come back to that. Soybeans again are a little bit more forgiving than the corn crop, but again, we need to keep some of these non-ideal planting conditions in mind. You can see a soybean plant again is able to again branch out from those auxiliary buds. So again, something to keep in mind. Another important point here is the replant coverage of the crop insurance piece, right? These dates recently got updated, I think maybe a year or so ago. they all moved 5 to 7 days earlier. So make sure you keep an eye on this as we target our plantings, right? And this is for the replant coverage of the total crop insurance piece, right? In terms of, again, optimal times, typically what I have seen is it starts around, late April in South Central Michigan, relatively close to these insurance dates I'm talking about, right? But the important piece here is that we need to be targeting fields that are suitable for early planting, right? I'm talking about, again, maybe a coarse texture soil or well-drained fields, compared to the ones we know that do get flooded, they stay wet. And those are the ones we do not want to be pushing for these early plantings, right? Because again, at the end of the day, it's about optimal field conditions, not the calendar day itself, right? We always thought, soil temperature is very critical, and it still is critical, right? Waiting for that temperatures to be reaching that threshold of 50, right? And a good forecast, right? And you can see a couple of these images here from last year, and even compared to this year, that, yeah, early April, we are still hovering in mid 40s or so. When we start getting to mid-April or so, that's when now we are getting close to that 50-degree threshold, right? And that can again lead to that imbibitional chilling injury, that first, drink of water the seed absorbs, right? Again, the data I was showing you, it seems to be, again, that our soybean plant is more forgiving in terms of non-ideal early plant stand, right? So again, it's a greater concern in corn, and I would highly recommend, using a sort of a, very cheap soil temperature sensor, though they are readily available now. Just go out and look for, at your planting depth, what that temperature is looking like. But more importantly, I think soil moisture has become much more critical. Again, we all have been seeing all these rains. Hopefully Jeff has a better uh, news for us here. But yeah, we do not want to mud that seed in, right? That has implications for the current season in terms of, non-ideal seed to soil contact, poor root growth, and things like that. But long-term soil compaction becomes a real issue, right? So we got to be very careful about that. So again, understanding what the soil moisture is, using some of these, field methods, or again, try to get a relatively, inexpensive soil moisture sensor. And as you can see in this picture, the ideal moisture range for planting or any field work depends on our soil texture, right? So we want to stay away from this gray zone, right? And you can see, compared to these coarse soils, the clays have a much higher threshold, right? Something, again, is becoming very important as we are starting to see more water in our system during this springtime. So moving on to this next idea, yeah, planting time is important. I have shown you this curve, but it's just one part of the whole system, right? How we can sort of change the trajectory of this curve, so to speak, how we can improve benefits from early planting while minimizing any negative implications from later planting, right? We don't want to be there, but now it does happen, right? We all remember 2019. Hopefully we never go back there. So in terms of, again, how we maximize our yield without putting too many inputs on it. So ROI, right? And this year, of all the years, that's going to be very important, where prices are, right? How we can maintain or improve yield without spending too much money on extra inputs, right? And that's where it becomes a system level approach, right? And I have my laundry list of things, to think about while we make planting decisions, right? Some of these factors you all have already decided upon, right? Like picking the right variety, picking those optimal maturities. We have seen benefit of going to longer season varieties with early plantings and things like that. So a couple of other factors here. Again, I won't be able to go through all of them. So we will cover some. Christy Sprague already talked about weed control a few weeks earlier, right? It's very important, especially for these early planting conditions. So those optimal pre followed by post applications are still very critical, if not even more critical Fertility is very important. I believe Kurt Steinke is going to be talking next week about that. We will touch on a couple of these other factors here, right? Starting with, again, this idea about seed placement, right? When we are planting, this is what we are trying to do, right? And I'm sure you all don't want to see something like this, right? Here we have variable planting depth. You can see those seeds at different depths, as well as we have these skips and we have doubles, right? So probably something we don't want to see. And this is probably more like what we typically are targeting, right? Uniform planting depth, uniform seed to seed spacing, what we refer to as singulation, right? So there's a lot of research, including recent data coming from corn, where uh, the uneven emergence that can occur because of non-ideal planting depth or non-ideal field conditions with these early plantings, right? uh, those are very critical. That uneven emergence, what we call sort of temporal variability, is much more critical than any within the row spatial variability, which is still critical, but we need to really make sure that we are minimizing that uneven plant emergence. Right. So in corn, yeah, all the bells and whistles we can get on our planter, it's very important and does pay off. The story is little different on the soybean side. Now we have data from Michigan and even some neighboring states showing, yeah, it's good if we can achieve this ideal seed placement, but soybean plant is more forgiving, as I have already shown you. That if you have a non-ideal emergence, a V1 versus a V3 plant sitting right next to each other, it's not as critical. Even relatively uniform stand is good. It does not have to be that picketed fence stand. So again, something to keep in mind. Another point I want to be talking here in terms of that optimal stand establishment to get that canopy closure, light interception, right, is the seed quality piece, right? And generally, we look at our germination percent on the seed tag, right? And for soybeans, you will either see generally, again, I've seen numbers mostly close to 90%, as you can see on this first seed tag. And these are from this year varieties. And then you can see another one here with the 85. I have seen some of these, and I've heard reports that there are more lots with the 85% germ compared to 90 this year. So something to keep in mind as we make decisions on our seeding rates, that because of those non-ideal uh, conditions last year, I think things were very dry. We had soybeans that were below 10% moisture. So the seed quality is something to really keep in mind. And generally, when we talk about these early plantings, we always recommend to use high quality seed. So what does that really mean, right? And there's this germ percent, which is what we call a warm germ. Is that enough? And generally, it's not. We highly recommend people to go and do some seed vigor testing, right? There are multiple tests out there, coal tests, and the saturated coal test is a good example, which simulates these cold and wet early season conditions, right? You can see as an example here that two lots here are showing very different emergence here, right? So again, something to keep in mind. Labs do have some standard protocols for this, but there can be a lot of variability. So I highly recommend using the same lab to send your seed for testing. Otherwise, you might see some different variation in results from different labs. So ask or try to get this seed vigor test data on top of that germ data if you are targeting some of these early plantings. All right. So again, talking about again that stand establishment, we have been talking about this. Soybean seeding rates. A soybean plant is very forgiving. It has this plasticity to be able to branch out at lower plant populations, right? Because of that, the response curve of population versus yield looks like this, where you do need a lot of plants to get to a yield level, but then even going from 95 to 99%, you can see it takes a lot of extra plants. And there's a long plateau here, right? This looks very different than what a corn response curve looks like. So again, because of this, the target on the soybean side becomes, in a year like this, can we cut down a little bit on the seeding rate without limiting our yield, right? while making sure we have a good weed control, because at lower populations, weed control becomes even more critical. So some of the data I have shown with you all again is the optimal seeding rate is dependent on the planting time. For some of these early plantings, including this early season, the optimal rate is anywhere from 130 to 150,000 plants. Only under these June plantings, we need to be really pushing that, right? This is from 15-inch conventional till, so the numbers might look a little different, but yeah, relatively they are about the same. And if we look at the economics of it using $9 or $13, you can see for early and mid season, we can save a lot on that seed cost. In the late season, this is where we have to be careful, right? In terms of corn, again, I have shown you this figure before as well. The optimal seeding rates are dependent on our yield environments. A lot of times we are in that 150 to 200 bushel yield environment in Michigan. So targeting about 32 to 34,000 plants per acre, accounting for again about 5 to 10% for germination or emergence loss is important. But knowing the field yield environment is very critical here, right? The last point here I want to make is again, we don't want to be thinking about this, but it does happen, right? Replant, right? And what does it look like in beans versus corn? Again, I think very important point here is the assessing amount of stand loss, right? Give it some time, 5 days or so, before making a decision. And then look at the pattern of loss. And that's where how corn and soybean plants work, it differentiates, right? For corn, needing that uniform emergence, uniform stand, replant is probably the way to go if we are below those threshold numbers. But in soybeans, we are finding out replanting or doing nothing as long as we have about 60,000 plants per acre is probably the way to go, right? So again, there's other factors here. We have put together some fact sheets that are available on our website. I highly recommend you to maybe look through those. So again, to wrap it up, a couple of important take-home points. Optimal planting time is critical for us in Michigan, but we need to be aware of the fact that marginal soil conditions can reduce yield. Very true for corn. Soybean is more forgiving, so something to keep in mind, right? And thinking about other management that needs to be changed based on that planting time, right? And then again, seeding rate, as we were talking, again, it depends on the yield potential. The idea is, can we cut down a little bit on the soybean side? Can we maybe push it a little bit higher on the corn side based on our field specific environments, right? And seed quality is going to be very critical this year. So keep an eye on that. Look for some of those vigor tests in addition to just the regular germ, and account for those in estimating your seeding rates, right? And then again, planting, replanting, stand uniformity, as we have been talking, is very important. Precise seed placement in corn, then soybeans. Use that in making any replant decisions if we do have to come to that point. All of this information is available on our website, which is agronomy.msu.edu. You can go to extension and look at by crop. We have a lot of articles, presentations, fact sheets there. And I will stop here and we can go to Jeff.
And thanks, Manny and Jeff, for great presentations. We've only got a couple of questions in the chat right now, so folks, feel free to, if you had something come up during one of the presentations that you were wondering about, feel free to drop that into the chat. I'm going to scroll all the way back up. We had, just for those of you who maybe joined a little bit later, just out of curiosity, we had Tom up in the thumb area said that he had planted soybean, had done some plots as early as March 13th. So for those of you who thought maybe you were getting in a little early, I guess there's always earlier. So don't know if there's been any emergence with that yet, but so that was interesting. We had one question for you, Manny. So talking about planting depth. So if soil moisture is not an issue, so you've got, optimal moisture and temperature. What is the optimal planting depth for soybean and probably for corn too?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I didn't have time to really touch on it, but yeah, Typically, I think it's the our target is for soybeans around inch and a half, for corn about 2 inches. So that's a starting point. I think for both crops, you want to err at least on that minimum, if not little deeper, right? We have been thinking, with the again with moisture, there's a variability there, right? But as the question says, that's not a limitation. That's the only piece where we might recommend, go shallow or go deeper, especially if moisture is a limitation. But typically, I think even for early season planting conditions, at this point, we do not recommend shallow plantings because, again, that can lead to, especially for corn, that can lead to uneven emergence. And that's a recipe for disaster, right? Even for soybeans, soil crusting is a real issue with some of these early plantings, and then you get a pounding rain, and then you get a crust formation. So other pieces do factor in, what sort of rotation you are in, what soils you have, those kind of things. But I think at least targeting that inch and a half for beans, and then going with 2 inches for corn. I think that's a really good rule of thumb to sort of keep in mind. Again, we can go a little bit deeper. If it's sort of a little bit coarse, more sandier soils. Maybe a little bit of late plantings. Shallow plantings. If it's again, if residue is a concern, some of these heavier soils, clay types, and if again they are on the wet side of things. So yeah, there are some caveats, but I think sticking with at least inch and a half for beans and 2 inches for corn, I believe is the way to go. There is some new research out of Nebraska showing, even 1.75 inches is the way to go on beans, but we have not done any research here in Michigan to validate those findings, if that makes sense.
So the next question is also for you, Manny, and you may want to have that up in the chat. I'm going to read through it, but it's got a lot of numbers in here.
Yeah,
So for the
thank you.
same population on 30-inch, 20-inch, and 15-inch rows, so same population, three different row spacings. For 30-inch rows, 6-inch spacing, 20-inch rows, 9-inch spacing, 15-inch rows, 12-inch spacing. So the question is, would 20-inch rows with spacing variation of 6 to 12 inches cause a drop in yield as long as there's no skips or doubles, uniform planting depth, and the population is maintained? So talking about
Mhm.
corn, talking about spacing. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so you guys can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so this is a really good question, and to sort of conceptualize for others, I'm putting this slide here, as the question says, you can see all these row spacing within the row numbers, right? It's very, it's a very big topic. We can spend half an hour on this. So I love, you're thinking this way. But again, I think, as I said, as a starting point, uh, the uneven emergence is very critical. Every research study I have seen shows the importance of the even emergence in corn, not beans, in corn, even emergence. Planting depth plays a role in there, and then your field conditions play a role in there, right? Optimal conditions does lead to that. So that's very critical. That's where typically the yield losses are severe on the corn side, because again the plant is not able to tailor out. It can compensate some, but again, if you have a V3 plant sitting right next to V1, that's where the issues are real. In terms of within the row spacing, as you're alluding, you can see on this cartoon in 30 inches at 34,000, because your row spacing and seeding rate are part of that. This is only at 34,000 seeds per acre, right? You have about 6 inches. In 22s, you're getting close to that 9 inches. In 15s, you're getting close to 12 at that same seeding rate, right? Some people try to push in narrow rows to a higher population, and then those numbers will change, right? The research on this piece is mixed. I have seen some papers, including a recent paper that says that, yeah, the yield loss, as long as you don't have skips and doubles. So meaning eventually, as long as your population that you were targeting, the 34 or 32,000 plants, as long as you have a high enough population for your yield environment, you are going to have a minimum yield penalty. Yeah, in corn, there's probably some, but it's going to be relatively minimal. So yeah, in your example, if the target was again in 22s down here, about 9 inches, if you are staying within 6 to 12, I don't have any research data to really know what the percentage might look like, but it's going to be relatively smaller as long as, again, as you're saying, your population is still close to what you were targeting. Right? If you have maybe some, again, non-ideal spacing, I believe that's where the current research is. I will try to maybe look into more research, but I think, again, my gut feeling is that, yeah, that's going to be a relatively lower, much lower yield penalty. So it's going to start again. The lowest, the least penalty is probably this case, right? The next one is going to be if you have skips and doubles, or more of the skips, because again, corn plant is able to compensate some, right? Soybean plant is able to compensate a lot because it's able to branch out and everything, right? A corn plant, we have taken the ability to tailor out even multiple years out of the genetics, right? Some hybrids can flex, others might not, there is some variability there. But again, because of that non-ideal seed to seed spacing, that's I think the number one. The number two is if that's leading to non-ideal plant populations, yeah, you probably will see some decent. And then the worst case scenario is when you have this really uneven emergence. That's where the research is very clear cut, that, yeah, when that happens, that's where you are worse off. And that's where we do not recommend on the corn world any repair plant, things like that. Replanting, tearing that stand up and replanting is the way to go because those plants start competing with each other, right?
All right. Thanks, Manny. So one correction, I had said the thumb areas where those early soybean planting was. That's actually Clinton County. And Tom says that no emergence yet. Got some sprouting, but no emergence yet. We'll switch gears. We'll give Manny a break. We've got a couple of questions that are probably more for Jeff. So first one is for alfalfa. Where are the GDDs that have a different starting temperature, which I think is 40? Are we ahead of normal in the southern part of the state? I just checked that for cold water a couple days ago, and we were maybe 70 or so ahead with base 40. So in general, across the state, but in the southern part of the state, Jeff, where are we at with alfalfa?
No, I think that's right on the money. And we've used 41 too as another base for alfalfa. But the pattern that you saw earlier here is clear. It's identical. It's identical pattern. We're probably 10 days to maybe even at least 10 days ahead of where we typically are in a given season across the southern half of Lower Michigan, and then much less or even behind as we go up to the north. And again, that's an unusual situation for us in Michigan. So the north is behind, the south is ahead. And as we move into warmer weather here over the next few weeks, gradually that probably we'll see that those changes uh, be reduced from what they are right now. But we're definitely ahead in the south.
So here's a fun one for you, Jeff. Maybe actually do a little teaching for us. So a week or so ago, temperatures in Midland County were 20 degrees warmer than in Lenawee. What type of weather pattern would cause that?
That's a so yeah, I did the Lenawee. I was a little surprised by that. I thought somebody might say, well, looking at a northern part of the state, that's it was with those big weather systems that moved through the Midwest and the Great Lakes region that brought a bunch of warm air and moisture with them. And it's not just the Great Lakes. You can see to our south, there's actually flooding going on from all the precip from those. But those weather systems we had southwesterly jet stream flow aloft, and that allowed air out of the Gulf and the areas to our south to move up into Michigan. And the low pressure areas basically act to redistribute the warm air towards the north and colder air from Canada to the south. And that's one of the things that the systems actually feed on, or what they're meant. That's why the system exists to begin with, is to try to minimize that gradient or that imbalance. And when we see those real strong weather systems like we did, remember there's also severe weather associated with those as well. We typically see those big changes in temperature over individual areas. But I think as I think about the actual question with the differences in the eastern and southeastern part of the state, that may have been due to the cold air wrapping around the back of the weather system, which is also associated with this low pressure system. And I did see this. If you go to EnviroWeather and look at those automated weather stations, we have 5-minute data. And if you use the mediogram, ask for a mediogram at an individual station or individual site, you can actually see these changes take place. And during one of those systems, we did go where the warm air made it up, the cold front came back, and there was a rapid drop in temperature of 10 to 15, even 20 degrees that occurred on the backside. And I'm guessing that that's the situation with those temperature change, the one Lenawee county that was mentioned. So but if you look at that mediogram, you can actually see that graphically, and that was about as high or a big a temperature change over a short period of time as we see in Michigan. And I'm trying to remember, it might have been on the Saturday, which day it was, but it was when that low pressure was right over. It was actually over northern Lower Michigan, and the warm air made it up into part of the state, but not the far north. But it was the cold air wrapping around the back that I think caused that particular incident. So good eye. And if you want to look at, yeah, actually you can go in and look at that on EnviroWeather and actually see that take place and the times of it. And I see Keith just loaded the site to see that. So check if you haven't seen that, check it out sometime. It's really you can see things and experience them and actually go back and look at what happened and when.
I've got one more weather-related question in here. With this cold spell that we've had this spring, when it does warm up, will we see 70 to 80 degree temperatures to even those out? I guess maybe we're talking about the medium range.
Right. And we could see 70 on Monday, this upcoming Monday in the far southern part of the state. I think, though, to the direct answer to the question is we're probably not going to see 70 anytime soon. Certainly not within the next week or week and a half. So I'm thinking probably not for for another couple of weeks. The medium range is really with the troughing over the east would suggest cooler. So I don't think certainly not 80. And again, 7, we may see that on Monday. That will be the warmest day of the upcoming week for most areas, and we'll be back into the 50s again for highs by the middle of next week and latter part of next week. So back to normal to below normal or cooler than normal. So it's not soon. I think is the long and the short of it here for seeing anything 70 or above.
Okay. All right. So we've got one more agronomy related question, Manny. Should
Uh,
we adjust corn seeding rates higher or lower for early planting?
that's a good one. Yeah, let's go back and look at the slide even here. So yeah, typically when we think about corn seeding rates, we are coming back to the yield environment, right? So typically the early planting situations have a high yield environment, right? So you want to maintain a high seeding rate. That's actually something we're going to do some research this year on that, because what we are finding out again with these early conditions, the yield penalty I was showing you, right? That again, it comes from the uneven stand, right? And I think that's the main piece. The the variability in spacing, as long as the stand is optimal, is I don't think going to benefit us. So I don't have data to say go a little higher than this 32 to 34 number I have here, but that's what we are going to be testing this year. That is that part of the limiting factor, or is it just that the uneven emergence, plants at different growth stages competing against each other, that there's no way around it. That's, I think, my working hypothesis, that you want gain by increasing that seeding rate a little bit. It's non-ideal conditions. I'm gonna maybe have low germ, emergence maybe more than anything else, and I might want to bump it up a little bit because every seed costs extra money, right? So I think, yeah, targeting for a timely planting, a good field conditions, I think is more critical than trying to get around that issue by bumping that seeding rate up a little bit. I think I would rather spend money on maybe making sure I get a vigor test, right? Those tests I was talking about, as I think I showed you this picture here. Because if I have a seed lot that has a high germ, but a low seed vigor, especially the saturated coal test, I think would be the ideal one for corn. I probably would look into that. And if that number is relatively or little lower, I will increase my seeding rate, right, by a higher percentage. Instead of going 5 to 10% higher than my targeted plant stand, I will bump that number higher. So that's the only case I think where I would recommend going beyond what those yield specific environment seeding rates are showing you, right? So that's the case for corn. Now on the soybean side, no, we have not seen benefit of pushing to a higher seeding rate with early plantings. Again, the idea is the early plantings are sort of high yield environments, and soybean plant is able to again branch out and do those things, right? You want some crop insurance, I think, on the soybean side. That's the only piece. So either you use a good seed treatment package, right? And I think Marty will say that to you as well. You know, if you're dealing with these non-ideal conditions, going with the seed treatment package is probably better than bumping up your seeding rate quite high. You don't have to do both. I think doing one to get some insurance on the soybean side, I think does probably make sense. On the corn side, I would probably rather get that germ test and change my seeding rate based on what that value is.
Okay, thanks, Manny. So I've got one more question for you, but right after that, I would like to open it up for other specialists and educators who are on. If you've got any insights you'd like to share or announcements, things coming up. So just want to cue that up. We'll come back to this question here. Have you ever tried skip row planting in corn plantings, two side by side, then skipping a row, then adding more seeds to the rows that are planted?
Okay, that's an interesting thought. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. So skip row. So you are, I assume, like in 30 inches, are you talking about, okay, side by skipping? Is this idea about like maybe twin rows, putting two rows closer and then having a skip row? Is that what? I don't know if you can unmute and maybe explain what your thoughts are. I have not done research on skip row. I think anything there is again in general on the corn world, you know, as you go from 30 to narrow rows, there is not a big benefit of narrowing your row spacing, right? On the soybean side, we see a benefit of going from 30 to 15 row spacings. So there's a benefit there. On the soybean side, we have not seen a benefit. It's minor, 2 to 3%, you know, going narrower, right? If you go other way around, you know, if you have a wider row spacing, I assume you will get some yield penalty. I think I've seen some twin row patterns where again the results are relatively similar. But if we are talking about skip row, leaving more than 30 inches between the rows, I think you will see a yield. Yeah, so it says 30-inch rows. So yeah, I think in skip row pattern in 30 inches, I believe there's going to be some yield penalty. You can compensate some of that by bumping up your seeding rate. But again, in 30-inch rows, that's already a limitation, right? You only have, as we were talking before, you only have about 6 inches between those plants at 34,000 population, right? If you bump it up even more, you are overcrowding those plants within those rows. And there might be some yield benefit, but I don't think in terms of profitability, you're gonna gain from that practice.
Thanks, Manny. So I would like to open it up to the other specialists who are on this morning or educators. Any insights or comments from anyone? Yep.
Eric,
Yep, Lyndon,
Lyndon
go
Kelly
ahead.
here. There's a recent article due to the storms that we had, early season storms, and we're just starting that storm season. Um, John Laporte and I refreshed the article about irrigation insurance. Do you know what your coverage is, and what do you do when you have a storm? What's sort of the checklist of things to work through? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Lyndon. For those of you who don't know, Lyndon is our irrigation educator throughout the state.
Eric, I would like to say that many times when producers receive a soil test sample results, especially for a grass field. There is a recommendation to have nitrogen applied at green up. Well, we are at that point really close, and it's one of those things where I think from a timing standpoint, that nitrogen, that initial nitrogen application is very important for grass producers. And so I would encourage that to be something to consider. Also, make sure that if you're putting potash out, that would be a good time to put that particular product out as well. So,
And I don't see Dennis on this morning, or Kurt. All right. I did have one comment come in from Teresa. This going back to that question about the skip rows of corn. In the past, skip rows were closer spacing, row width, maybe 20-ish, but blocking the planter wheel tracks. All right. Anyone else? And this will be my last call. Anyone have any other questions from the audience that you'd like to add in? You can
Eric,
either, hey, Marty.
hey, yeah, this is Marty. So just chatting with Dennis about some of the snow mold issues that we have in wheat. So if you've got any wheat fields, now would be a really good time to get out and just check how much. It seems like a pretty bad year this year, so probably culmination of factors. So good planting conditions last season, probably early planted. Those fields that have manure or high nitrogen, lots of growth. And then with that snow cover, has resulted in some snow mold, and that can kill plants. So just get out and check stands in your wheat fields.
Okay, thanks, Marty. For those who maybe haven't seen that before, can you describe a little bit about what they should be looking for? Oh, it sounded like Marty was maybe out and about on his phone, so he may not have heard that.
Yeah, I think Dennis and I think Marty, I think they wrote an MSU article, so you can just Google, snow mold wheat. I think it just looks, I think I've seen some pictures, again, some discoloration, again, browning, and I think probably at the bottom of the plant. So yeah, I think yeah, you can just Google it, I think quickly and find some good pictures.
It looks like a dye out in a field until you get closer, and then you'll see that they're like a really discolored white
Yeah.
brown color, and then there'll be the black dots also once you get closer. And yes, Dennis has some really great pictures, and I believe if it's not out yet, he'll be putting out a very thorough article in the Michigan Wheat News too. It's supposed to come out, I think, this week.
Okay. Thanks, Monica. All right, I don't have any other questions, so thank you, everyone. Another successful morning. Join us next week for presentations from Jeff and from Kurt Steinke. Everybody have a great day.